Hey everyone, how are we doing today? This is James Sweeney, aka Splitsuit, and welcome to my first video at Poker VIP. And this video is going to be all about O ranges and C ranges. And for those of you that don't know what those are, these are terms that I created when I wrote my first book, Dynamic Full Ring Poker. And the reason why I created these is because it's a nice way to visually look at ranges and quickly determine whether you can bluff well, value bet well, and just ultimately gives you a nice starter framework for looking at hand reading and range reading all together. So in this video we're going to define what O ranges and C ranges are. We're going to look at how to use them in a multitude of different ways, from 3-bet spots to 4-bet spots to post-flop spots, and just ultimately hopefully give you a nice little framework to work with, both for value betting and bluffing. So without further ado, let's just jump right into it, start having some fun, and talk about O ranges and C ranges. So let's first start by defining what an O range and a C range is. So an O range is the original range of hands. So essentially what your opponent has right this moment. So in a situation where our opponent raises from middle position, that would be his O range. What hands we think he's opening from that exact spot right now. We could also look at an O range when someone is 3-betting us. Say we open from middle position, our opponent 3-bets on the button, thinking about, okay, what kind of hands does he 3-bet with, and that is his O range, what hands he has right this very moment. A C range is his continuance range, and that's essentially what he's going to continue with if we make whatever play we make. So take a situation where we get to a flop heads up with a player, he checks, we C-bet. His O range is what hands he got to that flop with. His C range would be what hands he would give action to our C-bet with. So I feel the best way to explain this would actually be by using an example. So let's take a situation like this where middle position opens. And at this point we have to assign an O range. So what hands we think he would raise right this moment. So to graphically help with that, let's just pull out Poker Stove and let's assign him a range of any pair, Ace Jack plus, King Queen, and maybe a couple topside suited connectors. So let's give him essentially an early position, actually let's just give him that. So a middle position range of 12%. So 12% of hands is his O range, aka what hands he has right this moment. And sometimes we're not going to have an exact idea, but we can use things like HUD stats to our advantage, things like his middle position PFR. We can use just his PFR if we have a smaller sample and have to just make some sort of guess, or maybe we'll use a default idea on what the average player at that stake, at that game type raises. Obviously a middle position opening range at full ring is going to be a little bit different than 6 max, but it's still important to at least recognize that. So let's just start by assigning him this 12% range, which is probably pretty fair. Some players this would be looser, some players might be a bit tighter, but 12% of hands is an okay starting point. So that's an O range, not very difficult. Now, next we have to figure out kind of what his C range would be. So in this situation, we think that Ace-3 isn't strong enough to flat call, so our only options left are to fold or come over the top and 3-bet. And let's just say we're thinking about 3-betting in this spot, and we want to kind of see if this is going to be a profitable play. So what we can do is think about, okay, what would his logical C range be if we make this 3-bet? Now, unless he's just an absolute fish or someone who has no fold button pre-flop, chances are he's not going to continue with this exact range once we 3-bet. He's probably going to be folding at least some of it. So let's start building what we think he would logically continue with. And when he continues, when we're building the C range, we don't necessarily, when we're just kind of purely bluffing, we don't really care if he continues by 4-betting or continues by calling. We just really are focused on creating folds. So if he's folding enough, we're probably taking the bluff. If we don't think he's folding enough, we're probably not as likely to take the bluff. Very simple. This is not the end-all be-all of strategy. Obviously, we have to think about if he flats, the equity we have, the playability we have, if there's ways that we can bluff post-flop, blah, blah, blah. I'm just trying to simplify this right this moment, so we're starting with this easy example. We'll get more complicated in the future. So let's build a logical C range. So let's say that he would always continue with 10s plus and Ace-King. And we don't know if he would continue by 4-betting them or flatting them. Maybe he would, flat sometimes with aces and 4-bet sometimes with aces. It's just kind of we think he's going to continue with these hands. We're not exactly sure how, but we think that this is pretty close. So at this point we see that that's 3.5% of hands. So his O range is 12% of hands, and his C range would be 3.5% of hands. And that's not very complicated. So what we could do is we could use math after that to determine if this would be a profitable bluff, or maybe this isn't a great situation to bluff. So let's actually pull out some math real quick and see if this is a good situation for us. Okay, so pulling out the math for a second, we are risking $10 here to win $4.50, which means that the break-even point is 69%. So as long as we're getting folds at least 69% of the time, this is going to be an outright profitable bluff. If we are not getting at least 69% of folds, this is not going to be an outright profitable bluff. Now, you may wonder what I'm talking about when I say outright profitable. What that means is that we're generating enough folds right this moment to show profit. Now, obviously that's not the purest way of looking at this. If our opponent calls, we do have some equity going post-flop. We should have some playability going post-flop. Maybe we can throw out a bluff c-bet here and there, and that obviously gets us some value. But it's important, in my opinion, when you're starting talking about bluffing, that usually you focus on outright profitable bluffs, because it can get really complex and complicated when you're starting to look at the future value of bluffs, talking about double barrels, triple barrels, if you get called, actualizing your equity piece and what that's really going to be worth or not worth. It can just get a little confusing and muddy, and I usually suggest that you don't start with that. So what I want to focus on is outright profitable bluffs right this moment. So 69% is our break-even point. Given the math that we saw, we thought that our opponent had an O range of 12% and had a C range of 3.5%. Well, what we can do to figure out how often he would continue is simply take that 3.5 divided by 12. And we see that that's roughly a 29% range. So we think that our opponent is going to continue 29% of the time, and thus on the flip side, we think he's going to fold 71% of the time. Not very complicated. And as we see, we need at least 69% of folds to break even. We think we're going to get around 71% of folds, and as played, we expect that this is going to be an outright profitable bluff. Not very outright profitable by any stretch, but at least a little bit. So that's kind of the first way that you can think about this. Now, next you could start saying, okay, well, maybe his C range is a little bit tighter than this. Maybe he's actually sometimes folding ace-kings, sometimes folding tens. Now all of a sudden we see that this is going to be a very outright profitable bluff. We could also think about what if his opening range were a little bit wider. Let's say instead of opening just to 12% of hands, he were opening something closer to 18 and still continuing with that 3.5%. Well, now again, we notice that this is going to be an outright profitable bluff. We're generating enough folds, and thus this is a good situation to go for a bluff 3-bet. So you see how this is kind of the building block of going for bluffs and bluffing both in the 3-bet sense, in the 4-bet sense, in the c-bet sense, in the raise post-flop sense. It's all the same thing. Conceptually, it all starts the same way. What's his O range? If I make an aggressive action, what's his C range going to be? And then just making decisions based upon the math. If it's profitable, go for it. If it's not profitable, probably not going to waste my time. Very simple. So hopefully this kind of gets you thinking about that. It's not complicated, and a lot of this work, to be honest, should probably be done off the table until you internalize it. And you may wonder, what if I'm not a great hand reader? Then what do I do? Then I'm kind of left guessing. And you are to an extent, and you should always be working on your hand reading and your range reading. But if you spend some time, look at stats and stuff, if you're using a HUD, think about what your opponents are logically opening by position. And if nothing else, think about yourself. Think about the kind of hands that you open by position, the way that you react versus 3-bets. Are there situations where you're folding a tremendous amount of hands, and could you possibly use that to your advantage while trying to bluff your opponents? So again, this is a building block, this is a conceptual framework that is very, very useful for bluffing, and it's very important that you at least understand it. In my opinion, this is the easiest way to visualize bluffing. Just look at an O-range. If there's a massive gap in the O-range versus C-range, aka there's a big O-range, very tight C-range, it's a great bluffing opportunity. If there's a big O-range and a very, very big C range, so those ranges are very similar, you're not generating a lot of folds. So it's a good value betting or value 3-betting opportunity, but it's not an excellent situation to bluff, or at least in the outright sense. So hopefully, again, this gets you thinking. Let's run through a couple other examples to make sure we're understanding it. Okay, so let's actually look at a post-flop spot to visualize how to use O ranges and C ranges a bit better. So we take a spot where the button opens, we decide to flat call a king-queen, catch this board, we check, and he bets. So his O-range at this point is the hands that he would c-bet in this spot. So if he's someone that is going to c-bet 100% of the time, then his O-range is simply whatever he opened with preflop. If he is the kind of guy that would c-bet here, say only 60% of the time, then we have to take what he would have opened with preflop, most likely times it by roughly 60, and then we get a ballpark on how strong or how weak his c-bet range is weighted. So in a situation like this, it's not too difficult to get an idea on what his O-range is if he is c-betting 100% of the time. If he's c-betting less, usually it's going to be stronger. When his O-range is stronger, it's going to be more difficult to bluff because, again, his O-range and his C-range are going to be closer together, roughly the same size, which means there's very little folding going on, so it's difficult to bluff in that spot. Whereas if he has a massively wide O-range and his C-range is very tight, it could be a situation where we could consider going for a bluff check raise. So let's talk about what goes into this spot. So let's pull out Flopzilla, and this is an excellent piece of software if you've never used it before, and I'll do a video in the future on how to use it. And let's just give him a crazy wide O-range. So let's give him a 51%. So we're assuming that he steals 51% of the time, and that he's going to c-bet this board of ace-9-4 100% of the time. So he still has that full 51% of hands. And we see that he's hitting the board like this, lots of weak pairs, lots of top pair type hands, and let's think about what he's going to have as a C-range. And in a C-range, let's logically think about what he would continue with. So if we check raise, he's probably going to continue with top pair. He's probably going to continue with flush draws, definitely going to continue with sets and two pairs, and we're just kind of work from there. And I always like to kind of start with a worst case scenario, so I'm not even going to assume that he's going to fold ace-3 at this point. Just gives me a good starting point. So at this point, we think he's going to continue with top pair or better. So top pair, two pair, sets, and also going to continue with flush draws. And we see down here that that hits roughly 1/3 of the time, which subsequently means that he misses roughly 2/3 of the time, and we should be expecting folds roughly 2/3 of the time. So if we pull out our math, it's not too complicated to see that we are risking 13 to win 10.5, so we need at least 55% of folds to break even. If we think we're getting roughly 66% of folds, then obviously it's very easy to see that this is a profitable check raise. Now, this is kind of an ideal situation, one where we're making the assumption that he is c-betting a ton, has a very, very wide O-range, has a relatively tight C-range, and thus this is a spot where we can abuse someone. Now, in the real world, things might change a little bit. For one, he might not c-bet this entire range. Maybe his c-bet range is quite a bit stronger, and thus we'd want to keep that in mind. Maybe the C-range is a little bit different, though. Maybe instead of continuing with every single top pair, maybe he folds out some of the ace-deuce, ace-3, ace-5, ace-6. Now notice that I'm not talking at all about what we represent. In fact, in this situation, king-queen is roughly the same thing as pocket deuces, roughly the same thing as having a napkin and a brick in our hand. It's all garbage. All we're looking at here is our opponent's range and how he's likely to continue. That's it. And that's kind of the way that I like to think about bluffing. Obviously, in the real world, equity is always fun if we have at least some backdoor outs or something that we can catch. That's always decent. But this is just kind of the building block of looking for bluffing. Does he have a wide enough range? If I make an aggressive action, is he likely to fold it a lot? If yes, attack. If not, probably not. Very simple. So this is a relatively common situation, not exactly making the bluff check raise, but looking for this kind of post-flop bluff. Is again, what kind of hands does he logically have when he starts? If I make an aggressive action, how is he logically going to continue? And then abusing and attacking based upon all that. It's not very complicated. Actually, it's quite a bit simpler once you do some work with it. But again, this is the building block of looking for nice, profitable bluffs, especially outright profitable bluffs. Okay, let's go back to another preflop spot that I think is very important and can help visualize this spot. So take a situation where we open the cutoff with king-8, get 3-bet by the big blind, and we're deciding what we want to do. So at this point we have our three options. We can fold, we can call, or we can come over the top. Well, I don't really want to call here. King-8 suited isn't really strong enough to do that without some massive, massive, massive information. So because of that, my only options are to fold or come over the top and 4-bet. So let's talk a little bit about 4-betting, and in order to do so, we need to kind of think about O ranges and C ranges. So what's his O range? Well, let's say that this guy has a 10% 3-bet. Well, that would be his O range, 10% of hands. How exactly that 10% of hands is made up, we're not 100% sure. For instance, if we were to type 10% into this box in PokerStove, this is probably not the range of hands that you think a 10% 3-bet range looks like. Just most likely isn't. So maybe you think that his 3-bet range looks something closer to this, and maybe he throws in some bluffs and some suited ace-x, and maybe some that, maybe some suited connectors, and eventually this gets pretty close to 10%. So we don't know exactly how it's made up. All we know is that it's made up of 10%. And in all actuality, all I really care about is, can I generate enough folds if I go for a 4-bet? So in order to do that, we can simply look at some basic math. We can look at the math on the break-even point of our 4-bet. So say we were to 4-bet here to 22. That means we are risking $19 to win 13.5, which means that we need at least 58% of folds to break even. And then we can start looking at what he would logically continue with if we were to make that 4-bet. And let's just take an assumption of he would continue with queens plus and ace-king, which is roughly 2.5% of hands. From there, it's not too difficult. It's just 2.5 divided by 10, simply because you have a 2.5% C range, you have a 10% O range. We see that that's 25% of the time he's going to continue. Subsequently means he's going to be folding 75% of the time. We need 58% of folds to break even. We think we're generating 75%. Obviously, this is a very outright profitable 4-bet. And again, you notice I use that word outright profitable. I expect to generate enough folds right this moment to show profit, and thus I'm happy with that. Now, some things we want to consider is, one, what is he really 3-betting in this spot? Is he 3-betting 10% against us? Is he 3-betting closer to 15%? Or maybe is he 3-betting closer to 5%? If he's 3-betting 5% and he's still 3-betting always the queens plus ace king at least, and we think he's never going to fold that if we go for the 4-bet, not too difficult to see that we're not generating enough folds. That's going to be a negative EV 4-bet. Very simple. And also thinking a little bit about the C range as well. Is your assumption here correct? Or maybe does he 3-bet stack off things like jacks and ace queen? Obviously that's going to open up his continuance range. Maybe he also decides to throw a bluff hand into his 5-bet range as well. So now all of a sudden his C range gets even higher. So take the original queens plus ace king. Say he throws in a couple of suited connectors and a suited ace, now all of a sudden this number jumps up an extra point, and all of a sudden he's continuing more often, thus we're getting less folds, and thus our bluff is less and less outright profitable, possibly getting to the point where it gets negative EV. So again, this isn't very complicated stuff. It's actually quite simple, but again, you need to put the time and effort into it. You need to realistically assign ranges. Don't just assign these completely optimistic ranges, and don't just go in there 4-betting while guessing. I mean, have a legit reason. And in doing the O range and C range work and thinking about, okay, what does my opponent realistically have in his range right this moment? Does he realistically 3-bet this hand or that hand? Does he realistically 3-bet this wide or that tight? And the same thought process goes for everything. It goes for if we 3-bet and our opponent 4-bets. What's his 4-bet range? How is he going to continue if I 5-bet shove? And we can also look at this when we're talking about value hands. If, say, we had queens here, and we thought that if we came over the top, our opponent wouldn't make enough mistakes against it, well, his C range is actually going to be too strong where queens doesn't perform well, and then maybe we just flat queens pre. So again, this situation, this thought process is very, very common. And again, the thought process and the framework fits into a mold of situations. It fits into pre-flop spots with 3-bets and 4-bets and 5-bets. Fits into post-flop spots as far as raising C-bets and C-betting ourselves. It fits into turn and river bluffs. It also turns into value bets as well. Thinking about how if there's a big gap between the O range and C range. If there isn't, excellent situation to value bet. If there is a huge difference between the O range and the C range, most likely going to be an excellent spot to bluff. So again, hopefully this kind of gets you thinking about how to use this framework, because it is very, very powerful. It doesn't need a tremendous amount of work. I mean, you spend a little bit of time with it just so you get comfortable with it, comfortable with the math as well, and all of a sudden this O range and C range thought process can be very, very helpful. So that's going to wrap it up for this video. Again, in this video we looked all about O ranges, C ranges, defined them, talked about how to use them in some real examples, And again, the big thing is just doing this work off the table, getting comfortable with it, understanding how big an O range logically is, how tight a C range logically is, and remembering that these things will change per game. I mean, O ranges are going to be wider pre-flop as far as the opening ranges are going to be wider at 6 max versus full ring. The 3-bet ranges are usually going to be wider at 6 max versus full ring, but also the C ranges are going to be a little bit different in each game as well. So think about how it applies to your game, and this thought process applies to online, applies to live, applies to 6 max, applies to full ring, applies to heads up, applies to anything where there's poker being played. The big important thing is, again, understanding the basic math, understanding how to figure out a break-even point and how to compare basic range analysis to that, and also thinking a little bit about if our opponent is more aggressive, is he more likely to turn certain hands that we thought would normally fold into a bluff, and thus he's folding less often, and thus is our bluff going to be worthwhile. In general, as I've mentioned earlier, I do focus a lot on outright profitable bluffs. I want my opponent to fold versus a c-bet right now enough of the time. I want my opponent to fold versus this 3-bet enough of the time right now that I show outright profit. But again, in the real world, sometimes that's not always the case. Sometimes we do have to think that step ahead, and that's okay. But again, just make sure you're being logical with it. Make sure you put some time and effort into it. And I think O ranges and C ranges will become a very, very helpful framework for you. So if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to let me know. Otherwise, good luck out there, happy grinding, and good luck with your O ranges and C ranges.